you like new, sensational, commercial, aberrational, just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle. Just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle. Oh, give us some yuppie stuff, upscale and puffy stuff, features on pasta and crab. Whenever we eat, we dine, always a hip chick time. Life without sushi's a drag. We like to make our stories brief, concise, and short. Each news release don't tax their minds, is our belief. A thinking brain gives too much grief. Don't tax their minds, is our belief. A thinking brain gives too much grief.
Hello, I'm Ben Bagdikian, and I'd like to talk about some newspaper myths. And I think the San Francisco Bay Area is an ideal stage to demonstrate some of the fallacies that are cherished by newspaper publishers and by a lot of journalists. The myth number one is a cruel one. It says that cities deserve the newspapers they get, that a newspaper would fail if it didn't reflect the needs and wants of the population, and that if it failed, of course, a new paper would come in and it would be closer to the people it serves. It's a nice idea, and it seems perfectly reasonable, but it happens to be wrong. San Francisco has one of the highest demographics of any major city in the country. People are better educated than in most cities, higher incomes, and they're more liberal than almost any urban population in the country. And it would seem to follow, I suppose, that as a result, the San Francisco papers would be extremely sophisticated in their news, comprehensive and serious about national, international, and local news, and that they would be very liberal. Right? Wrong. The San Francisco papers have been notorious for decades for being very low in their journalistic quality and ranging from conservative to reactionary. And that is not peculiar to the San Francisco area. It's simply more dramatic because of the difference between what the population is like and what the papers are like. And we see that there are papers in places like Louisville, Kentucky, and Providence, Rhode Island, not great centers of world culture and sophistication, that have very good newspapers. And we have papers in sophisticated cities like San Francisco that have had poor newspapers for a long time. And that leads us to the conclusion that the newspaper that a city gets is almost entirely a matter of chance of who owns the paper and what this owner perceives to be his or her self-interest. Then why is it that the paper doesn't fail? The San Francisco Chronicle, which is the leading paper in San Francisco, has been extremely capricious in its news, including national and international news. A little better lately. It has been part of the laughingstock in American journalism for its devotion to fun and games and fantasy and weirdo kinds of stories. It is an extremely conservative paper in a city that is steadily very liberal in its politics, and yet it's extremely successful financially. And why does that happen? Well, first of all, almost all American papers give minimal attention, but a minimum at any rate, to melodramatic national and international news. So that if you are cruising page one on the way to the sports section or the comics page, you do see whether the world is still in one piece as you go through to the less important news. But also, there is another basic reason, and that is that most of a newspaper's money comes from the advertisers, not to the people who buy the paper. The advertising in an American paper provides over 75% of the revenues, and that's the group that has to be satisfied. Now, naturally, the paper needs readers because otherwise the advertisers won't buy ads. And so they do need some readers, and they put out a number of things in the average paper that have nothing to do with serious news. There's the comic strips. There's the stock market report. There are sports scores. There is advice to the lovelorn. There are all kinds of things that are technological and mechanical, have nothing to do with real live reporting, and which are useful to people, if for no other reason that people will get their daily TV listings out of the daily paper. So that people don't buy a paper solely for the news, but they do want some news. But they will forgive a paper being shoddy in its news if the paper serves these other interests. So that your paper can get away with having shoddy news, and many papers in this country do. And furthermore, the public has no choice. There are 1,700 daily papers in the United States, and in 98% of newspaper cities, there's a local monopoly. And when you have a local monopoly, you can get away with a great deal because people have no choice. And in San Francisco, there's not a technical monopoly because there's another paper in the city. The Chronicle is alone in the morning, and there's the San Francisco Examiner in the afternoon. Now, they've had very different histories, and they used to compete, but they don't really compete much anymore. The Chronicle, in its devotion to fun and games and sending reporters to Tanzania to buy a slave, as they did years ago, or reporting on mythical man-beasts in the Oregon woods, which they in the Examiner used to do regularly, and similar hijinks, at least comes by it honestly. It was started after the American Civil War as an entertainment review. San Francisco was a wild and woolly place, and editors used to solve their differences frequently by gunfire. Editors who disagreed with each other tended to challenge each other to duels, and there were a lot of those. Or they beat up their opponents on the sidewalk, or they shot them. The Chronicle was started by a couple of young brothers, Michael DeYoung and Charles DeYoung, borrowed some money from their mother's landlord, started this entertainment paper, and then turned it into a newspaper. Eventually, they got interested in politics, and Charles DeYoung so disapproved of a candidate for mayor of San Francisco that he shot him, seriously wounded the mayoral candidate, and the candidate's son took this in poor grace and shot and killed Charles DeYoung, after which his more conservative brother Michael took over, and that started the San Francisco newspaper dynasty, which continues to this day. The same family, the DeYoungs and the Theriards, still own and operate the Chronicle. But the Chronicle, for many decades, had been second to the Examiner. The Examiner, of course, is notable for having been William Randolph Hearst's first great success in the newspaper business. He took it over when he was a 24-year-old college dropout and turned it into a spectacularly successful paper in terms of money-making. It was sensationalist, and of course that's what the history books talk about, and it was sensationalist, and it was sleazy in lots of ways, and had a lot of so-called yellow journalism. But it had something else that the history books don't talk about so much, and that is that at that stage in his life, William Randolph Hearst was a socialist, and the paper spoke for the working class and better working conditions and housing conditions for the poor, and gathered much of its original support from working people. It became, eventually, the leading paper in San Francisco. Now, William Randolph Hearst changed. He became extremely conservative. His papers were frozen in the early 20th century, and the Hearst chain was well known for having local publishers who waited for word from the Hearst castle on what to do, and they lost touch with the American people. The Hearst papers became more and more reactionary, more and more idiosyncratic, but in San Francisco, the Examiner was so established that it was the most powerful paper in the city. It said that in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that the police department and City Hall waited to find out whether their next move would be approved by the Examiner before they made the next move. And the Chronicle was a poor second to the Examiner. And then in mid-1960s, something interesting happened. The Chronicle started creeping up on the Examiner, but the Examiner was still ahead. So the owners of the Examiner and the owners of the Chronicle got together in a hotel room in San Francisco, and they came out as business partners. They decided that they would no longer compete with each other in a business way, but that they would, while keeping independent newsrooms, continue to work together in a business way. They would print together in a separate company. And then what happened was Hearst gave up its dominance in the morning field, went to the afternoon, and a kind of death wish for any newspaper in a modern city. And the Chronicle became the leading paper in the morning, and therefore, being a morning monopoly, it has made lots of money. They divide their profits 50-50. And so while they technically have competition, it's competition with a leash. Neither business partner is really going to hurt the other, and they have formed a powerful advertising monopoly in the whole area, and they are comfortable with each other. The Examiner has frozen in its circulation at less than a third of the Chronicles, and so the public doesn't have a choice, and that's why the papers can be very different from the needs and wants of the people in San Francisco, but they can still make a great deal of money.
So what newspaper do you read?
The Examiner, San Francisco.
What do you like about it?
There's really nothing to dislike or like about it. It's just one of the newspapers that comes to my house, so I read it.
The San Francisco Chronicle. Basically, I've been reading it for a long time. It's more force of habit than anything.
I read it because after I listen to the news in the morning, I read it to kind of get a weird slant on what I heard.
And I also like the Macy's section in the Sunday Chronicle, the Macy's California Living.
Examiner.
What do you like about it?
In general, I like it. Good sports. I'm a sportsman.
They're about the same because they're from the same house, you know. So the staff, they're not trying to be that much different than one another. So they don't have much to say.
Most paper I like to read is the Chronicle.
What do you like about it most?
Herb Cain. I like the green sheet. And I liked some of the articles I read about it.
There are a lot of legends and myths about American newspapers, and they're frequently so simple they're almost like a cartoon. But they're firmly believed, or at least talked about, by mostly newspaper publishers, but also a lot of journalists. And that myth is that competition lowers the quality of the news. The rationale of that is supposed to be that when papers compete, they sink to the lowest common denominator. They get competitively sensationalist to attract the reader's eye, and therefore it is really much better that there are monopolies. Now, that this myth happened to grow as papers became monopolies, and it may be a matter of evolutionary adaptation, and it has a certain kind of historical and rational grounding. It was true that in many places, especially in the late 19th century, competition by people like Hearst and Pulitzer in New York, for example, did in fact produce intense sensationalism. But that was not always the case, and it certainly is not the case in modern American newspapering, and for many, many reasons. For one thing, the American population is much more sophisticated and has many more sources for its information now, books, travel. Most Americans now have had some college, and so forth. In addition, most newspapers are home delivered. So you don't catch the eye and cause the purchase, except in the downtown vending machines and in the news vendors' booths. But most papers get delivered at home, so the big headline doesn't increase business that day. But there may be another reason, too. And that is that journalism, in general, is better than it used to be, because it has to be. The American public is much more involved in the world, much more conscious of being affected by economic and political decisions than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And San Francisco, as usual, is a wonderful laboratory to see how that myth is fallacious. The San Francisco Chronicle and the Examiner have, for the last 20 years, dominated San Francisco Bay Area in news. They were notoriously poor papers when it came to serious news, and stayed that way. The Chronicle was devoted to fun and games, capricious treatment of news. No axe murder in the world was safe from the front page of the Chronicle. And the Examiner, while trying to do better, has been a paper in search of a personality. And when you ask the people who put out the Chronicle why they did it that way, they said that's because that's what people want. And they came out as great champions of democracy in giving people what they wanted. And then a few years ago, something happened that changed the mind of the editors about what people wanted. San Jose is 40 miles south of San Francisco, and the San Jose Mercury and News, for years, had been one of the richest and lousiest papers in the country. Very low in journalistic quality, but very rich because it was in a city that was expanding and in a way was the capital of Silicon Valley. And it was a part of the Ritter chain. And then the Ritter and Knight chain combined, and the Knight chain had been one of the better ones journalistically, and they were smart enough to see that in 20 years journalism quality pays off, but most chains aren't interested in 20 years, they're interested in the next annual report. But the Knight sent one of its best editors to San Jose, and in a very short period of time, the San Jose Mercury News became a much better newspaper, the best paper in the Bay Area, and got very ambitious. And in this big pond, which is San Francisco Bay, with cities around the rim and newspapers around the rim, any paper that gets energetic around the rim makes all its neighbors nervous. At about the same time, the two papers even closer to San Francisco, in cities, Redwood City and Palo Alto, got bought by the Chicago Tribune. The other end of the Bay Bridge is Oakland, and the Oakland Tribune, which had been a cruelly handled paper for years, had a change. It used to belong to the Nolan family and was the mouthpiece for ultra-conservative Republicans in California. It was then sold to a billboard operator, Carl Eller, whose chief concern was giving speeches about the sinfulness of government welfare while he quietly applied for a government grant to help build new presses for his paper. And then it was sold to the Gannett chain, the biggest newspaper chain in the country. Well, suddenly, San Francisco Bay Area was populated not by independent poor papers, but by some very heavy hitters in American journalism. The Chicago Tribune, the Knight Ridder chain, Gannett. And then about the same time, the New York Times started delivering its Western edition in neighborhoods in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the Gannett chain announced that it was going to start a new national newspaper, USA Today, which would be sold in San Francisco. At that point, the editors of the Chronicle decided that the American people, and especially the San Francisco audience, wanted something better. And the axe murders went off page 1. They began to highlight New York Times news stories. The Examiner brought in a new editor and has a somewhat talented staff that produce interesting stories if somehow put together in a haphazard way. And both papers became editorially better. Now, when the Chronicle was confronted with competition from other papers, it did improve its national and international news. It did not improve its local news. And the Chronicle is notorious among big American papers for not covering its own city routinely and systematically. It did not change, I think, locally, because its competitors were competitors in national and international news, papers in nearby cities, the New York Times, and so forth. And national papers and non-city papers don't cover local news in each place, just the national news. And under that competition, the national news and the Chronicle got better. Now, that might lead to a conclusion, which is also another myth, that chains are good for journalism. Because after all, in the San Francisco Bay Area, a number of chains came in, and presto, the San Francisco Chronicle got better in its national news. But I think it doesn't follow. I think that that myth about how chains are good for us grows just the way the myth is that monopoly was good for us, because just as monopoly grew, so did chains grow. Chains now control 3/4 of all newspaper sales every day, and about 14 chains have most of the newspaper business in this country. And so there has grown this legend that they're really good for the reader, that they can put lots of money into a paper and that they improve quality. Now, the studies all show that that's not true. These chains buy papers for investments, and they're very good, they're very sophisticated in deciding how much money they can make with as little energy as possible. So what happened in San Francisco Bay is not, of course, an argument for the virtue of chains in journalism. Now, in this detachment that the major papers so often have from the particular interests of their audience, there are some alternatives. In San Francisco, the main one has been the Bay Guardian, which for years has published stories that and investigative stories that the Chronicle and the Examiner would not do, and have criticized major interests and corporate interests that the Chronicle and the Examiner stay away from, or certainly the Chronicle, and has been fairly successful as a weekly. And there are other papers that try to fill in the cracks. But they have the problem of the little fish swimming in the tank with the big fish. There have been lawsuits brought by a couple of the smaller papers against the Chronicle Examiner, because the Chronicle and Examiner are business partners, and they offer advertising rates that practically sweep the board for the whole area and leave the smaller papers on a starvation diet. And they're denied some of the features which the big papers tie up on an exclusive basis. All of this has been a matter of lawsuits. None of those papers have won them, at least not yet. And it means that they struggle. They fill the cracks a little bit, but they can't fill the whole space that is filled by the big fish. So the fact that the change came into the San Francisco Bay Area forced the Chronicle to be more serious in its news is unfortunately not an endorsement of change, but simply one of competition. In San Jose, which became a much better paper, it was a chain paper before and it's a chain paper now. It just tells us that there are some chains that are worse than others. In Oakland, the present owner and publisher, Bob Maynard, its former editor, got together enough money to buy it and is struggling to recover the bad wounds imposed by the previous chains. So the fact that the change came into the San Francisco Bay Area forced the Chronicle to be more serious in its news is unfortunately not an endorsement of change, but simply one of competition. And when you add to that, that part of that competition was the Western edition of the New York Times, which is published in New York, but printed on the West Coast. Adds to the fact that it isn't just the change, it's the fact that if you have competition, and if you think that you have to, that you will change the paper to fit the needs of your audience, that really does work. Because the audience in San Francisco, as a matter of fact, the audience in the United States as a whole, is much more liberal than its newspapers, much more open to serious news about things they care about than most papers give them. But most papers can concentrate on the content that will attract ads and that will be minimally troublesome and will cost as little as possible. And if it takes live reporters to cover things in the city, then that's expensive. Local stories cost almost twice as much as the stories that come out of the syndicated machines, and newspapers will prefer it. If they have competition, they will start covering things in a live way, and if they have competition, they will be forced to be closer to the needs and wants of the audience that they say they're serving.
We write of food and sex and crime, high fashion, scandal, and fine wine. To get those ads, we toe the line and rake in every nickel and dime. To get those ads, we toe the line and rake in every nickel and dime. I'm poor little Herbert Kane, dear little Herbert Kane. My column's always around. I spoof 'em and joke 'em, but don't say I toke 'em. I never am serious or sound. If you like news sensational, commercial, aberrational, just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle. Just take your pick, the Merc, the Trib Examiner, or the Chronicle.